Okay, we've got 12 o'clock. I'm sure that we'll have people joining us as we go, but we're going to start because we've got about an hour here. So welcome everybody that's here. I'm Jeff Davis. I'm the Interim Director of Executive Education at RIT, Saunders College of Business. And we're going to have a discussion today about the future of globalization and what's happening with it right now, and then tie it into some current events. With us today are John Strebick, who teaches in the Executive MBA for us, and also teaches at other universities, but we won't mention those right now. John teaches economics, finance, valuation, and capital budgeting for us. And we also have Greg Van Laken joining us today. And Greg is the Managing Director of Investments here at RIT. He manages the overall investment fund. I think he also manages the student investment fund. He, for years, has been responsible for our growth in overseas opportunities for RIT, our overseas campuses, and also teaches international finance in the Executive MBA program. Greg and myself are both alumni of the Executive MBA program. John was a graduate of Saunders MBA program, and that's still a valuable degree, I understand. So I just wanted to introduce ourselves and tell you who we are. Our topic today is really focused on what's happening with globalization. And globalization has been, I mean, if we wanted to go back really far, we could say, you know, the first real wave of globalization was 1870 to 1914, pretty consistently growing. And then, of course, something big happened in 1914 that changed the course of globalization that we're all probably familiar with. And then it started growing again, and it didn't stop again until the big act that came out in 1930. Remember the name of that act, John? The Smoot-Hawley Act?
Hawley Tariff Act.
Yeah, so all of a sudden they wanted to start putting a lot of controls into growth, and then companies started competing. We're seeing something similar to that happening again today. But then it had a real decline in globalization, or a real, at least, freezing of it until after World War II. And after World War II, it continued that trajectory of growth and globalization. And that lasted consistently until 1990, when it just took off like a rocket, and it became a huge thing. The interesting point is that since 2012, we've had a pretty consistently slow decline in globalization. And now, what do we define globalization as? Everybody's got their own. The most common is flows of foreign investment, so FDI, and travel of migration, right? What's happening with people, how they're crossing borders and finding opportunities. Merchandise exports as a share of GDP. These are the things that used to be measured to control what globalization is. And today, maybe that definition has changed, and we may talk about that a little bit. So let's talk about what's happening right now. You know, World War I slowed down the first run of globalization. The Great Depression and then World War II kept it at hold for quite a while. Here we are in 2020, and we've had a major economic downturn in 2009, 2010. We had the pandemic. We had what that's done to the economy. And we've had the administrations around the world that have become more nationalistic. And all of those things contribute greatly to a change in globalization. And that's probably why FDI has decreased since 2012, and merchandise exports have decreased 20% since 2008. And definitely a change in migration patterns and people's free flow for employment. And all of those things contribute. So I'll start with John. John, what do you think is the direction of this? Is this going to come back out like we have the other times we've gone through these declines or freezing of the growth? Or do you think it's going to rebound and be something completely different?
And again, when we're talking about this subject, we have to realize that, you know, we're in a very dynamic environment, that things are changing from week to week, month to month. But I'm on the side that globalization will continue to decline, and I believe it's going to accelerate. One of the things that the pandemic showed us was the importance of self-sufficiency. My wife is a healthcare provider, a lot of difficulty getting PPE in March and April. And one of the reasons for that was because a lot of the basic PPE, the masks and shields and things like that, were coming from other countries, specifically China. Another thing when we take a look at self-sufficiency is when we take a look at the pharmaceutical industry and some of the basic components of some of the different pharmaceutical products are really predominantly produced in two countries. Number one is China, and number two is India. And I think that the pandemic, what it got a lot of people to look at was that we needed to have a more diverse supply chain. And I think what we're going to see is more of a move to what I call regionalization. Rather than having a global supply chain, maybe one or two big suppliers, I think you're going to change your supply chain so that they're more regional. For example, North America, maybe you're going to have a supply chain that's going to have more suppliers in Canada, the US, and Mexico. And maybe the USMCA will be something that accelerates that also. Maybe in Asia, you have a supply chain that deals with, China, countries like Vietnam, the Philippines, Thailand, South Korea, and Japan, same with Europe. So I think what's going to happen is these massive integrated supply chains, where a lot of times you're counting on one or two huge suppliers. I think you're going to break it down a little bit. And what that'll do is that'll lead to a decrease in globalization, probably lead to increase in prices, because you're going to lose some of the economies of scale that you have with those huge supply chains.
Interesting, interesting. Now, you mentioned a couple things I want to point out here. Number one, you talked about the importance of self-sufficiency. And that reminds me a bit of what the last few administrations have tried to focus on in the US. One of their goals has been oil independence, right? And that's probably leading to one area of change in this overall global dynamic. And we always look at, I don't know why, but oil is one of the first prices we always go to. We want to see what's happening in the oil industry. We want to see what's happening globally. Greg, what's your take on how US's approach towards oil independence has led to a decrease in globalization, or if it has?
Yeah, I want to back up just a little bit to one of your earlier comments about it all kind of depends on what your definition of globalization is. And I always like to borrow one of my favorite definitions of globalization came from Indra Nooyi, the former CEO of Pepsi. And she used to define globalization as simply the acts of producing wherever it's most cost effective, selling wherever it's profitable, and sourcing your capital wherever it's cheapest. And so from my perspective, if you look at the definition of globalization from that perspective, I would say that, we're still going to do that, right? Companies are still going to produce wherever it's most cost effective. It's just that the variables are changing a bit based on, these various shocks that we've had to the system. I think companies are still going to want to sell wherever it's most profitable, and they're certainly going to want to source capital wherever it's cheapest. Again, from those, the factors of production type of equations, right? I think the variables change, but I think the goal is still going to be the same.
So before we go to oil, Greg, let's talk about that for a second. We talked about this about a month ago in a different context, but many American firms found when they hit the pandemic here that they needed to think about their global supply chain again. They needed to recreate it maybe. There were many people that worked in smaller manufacturing firms that had sole sourcing coming out of China, and they needed to make changes immediately. And several of them found that it actually turned out to be less expensive than they thought to manufacture regionally, as John would have said. Very likely even in the US. When they took out some of the transportation costs and other associated costs, they could do it just as efficiently locally. And is this going to be a long-term thing? Is this going to be something where, we know from economics that specialization leads to success for both nations. It helps a country to develop, it helps the other countries to continue to grow and become more technological. But what happens when you find that you can bring these lower, earlier, let's just say, skill sets back to your own country and can create value that way? What's that going to do overall to globalization?
So again, though, this is a very specific example, but I'm sure there are many, many other examples. And so one of the things that I've learned is, so we're all quarantined, right? We're all bored. We're all probably buying things that we wouldn't ordinarily buy. And, one of the things that we're looking at is like, man, it'd be really nice to have a hot tub. And so we're looking at this Saratoga Spas, which is a New York State company. We're like, wow, that's really great. They They manufacture these spas here in New York State, and most of the components to their spas are also made in the United States. Well, guess what? You can't get one of these spas until August, because it didn't even matter that their supply chain was 100% domestic. When something like this event occurs, everything was shut down, right? Their manufacturing was shut down. The manufacturing of all of their suppliers was shut down. So
Are you implying that hot tubs are not essential? Is that what I'm hearing?
yeah, so I'm just saying, like, it almost doesn't matter. Like, so you can say, yeah, we're not gonna depend on these foreign suppliers anymore. But when something like this happens, it doesn't even matter. And a friend of mine actually works for Lexmark, and early on he was saying, like, oh, you know, thank God we moved some of our production from Wuhan to Mexico. Well, that didn't last very long, right? Because even though they beat it for a little bit, right? Because Wuhan got shut down first, eventually Mexico did too. And so something like this obviously is a once in a lifetime thing. And sure, I think it's going to change the way people think, but again, like, even having a purely domestic supply chain is no guarantee that you're going to beat any challenges that are going to come in the future.
John, anything you want to add to that?
Well, I think, you know, when we take a look at the basics of economics, there's the theory of comparative advantage, which is basically do what you do best and forget the rest. I mean, that's basically what it is. And, you know, was followed, you know, starting in the 1870s, again, after World War II, to lead to globalization. And everybody said, you know, what we're going to do is we're going to specialize, and therefore we get really good at something, we're going to do it the best, and then everybody else can specialize in their own things. The only thing that has really changed since, and it really was the recession of 2008, 2009, where we really started to see globalization start to backtrack, was, again, Jeff, what you talked about at the beginning, was this change in politics, the populism, nationalism. And economists don't like to talk about politics. We want to talk about rationality and things like that. And, you know, a lot of times politics isn't necessarily rational. And you're seeing, not only in the United States, but in countries like Brazil and Hungary, Poland, a lot of countries where, you know, it's look out for me first, and we'll worry about everybody else later. And that really goes against globalization. Globalization is a mindset. It's really sort of a real change in how do you think, that you think globally. You don't think country by country, region by region, that you think about just one economic system, which is really what, especially in the 1970s and 80s, when globalization really kicked into gear, a lot of countries followed free trade. Then suddenly we started to hear fair trade, which is backing off of free trade, checking on countries on labor practices, environmental practices. And now what do we hear? Now we hear about tariffs, and we hear about quotas, and we hear about other types of protection. And so you got to add politics into the mix. It's a really big change. I mean, we've had other major events that have hurt supply chains. We had the Fukushima earthquake and tsunami in Japan that really disrupted the auto industry because it affected so many auto suppliers. The floods in Thailand a couple years later, the factories are underwater, and again, affected the auto supply industry. But what you have now is you have the pandemic, but you also have this huge change in how we view economics. And we're looking at economics through a different lens. It's more of a country lens than it is of a global lens.
So it's interesting, John, you bring up that it's not just the US. Many people think that this move towards nationalism is the US. It clearly isn't, right? The Czech Republic, you mentioned Poland, you mentioned Hungary, Brazil, of course, now. And there's a lot more. It's actually even in countries that aren't dominated by it. So for example, even in France and Germany, there's growth in those parties that are pushing for nationalism and populism. It is a challenge, but now let's look at this from another side. You also mentioned free trade agreements and other types of agreements. And even back during the past election, and we don't want to get too political here. This is a good reason that can be brought up, though. Both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump vowed that they were against the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And this was an agreement that was designed to really make a difference for the US because it didn't include China. It included pretty much the rest of those Asian nations that we work with, but not China. And that was a good deal for all those countries that were competing with China in some regard. But we now had both parties on both sides of the spectrum against this agreement because the belief was that the population of the US in general was against it. And they both needed votes, so they were going to vote against it either way. What we ended up doing was moving ourselves out of an agreement that everybody else in the region would still end up doing. And so I don't think it does a lot of good for the US. I think in the end, it probably harms the US to some degree. And it might even open the door for China to become a member of that partnership that we are no longer in. Any thoughts on that, Greg? I know you followed this a little bit as well.
I think it kind of gets back to what John was saying earlier about there's probably going to be a more multi-pole world than what we have now in terms of trade. And so, as John was saying, there probably is going to be like a North and South America kind of pole. There's going to be a European pole. And there's going to be an Asian pole. And, you know, companies are going to jockey around to get their place in those poles. I think, and again, you know, based on the political environment, that's probably where we're going just because that's how people feel right now.
John, anything else?
You know, and I think that I mean, look at our upcoming election. I mean, you have both parties who have I mean, I'll call it what it is, an anti-China stance. So like you mentioned, Jeff, with 2016, an agreement on the TPP and also an agreement on renegotiating NAFTA, which is now the USMCA. Now you have agreement on, you know, trying, and we'll call it the China containment policy because that's basically what it is. So again, I think that shows me that the trend is going to continue. And I believe that the pandemic is an accelerant that's going to just make it go quicker. But I mean, I agree with Greg. Are we going to become anti-global? No. There's always going to be globalization. Globalization gives us more selection of products. It keeps inflation down. I mean, it keeps quality up because it increases the competition. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the quality of US cars in the late 1970s or early 1980s. And, you know, there were quotas to keep, especially the Japanese cars out, and the US automakers did not use that time to try to improve the quality. So it's like you need those components. I just think that, again, it's going to be less of an effect than it was, let's say, 1990s, early 2000s, when globalization really was taking off.
For everybody that's listening, by the way, feel free to use the chat box to type in any questions you've got, and we'll try and get to those as we go through the discussion. John, you mentioned China, and that both parties look like in the US that they're going to be have somewhat of an anti-China agenda. Let's look at China overall. I mean, I know that right now their economy is as poor as it's been in about 50 years. But China has some great long-term planning. They do that very well, and the US does not do that nearly as well. China doesn't look for the next election. They're looking for the next 25 years and 50 years. And their Belt and Road Initiative, for example, it may not be popular, but it certainly has been effective. They've done a lot of things to create some growth and some opportunity for China, and to give them opportunities that the US used to take in countries where we aren't as prevalent now. We find ourselves on a much shorter timetable and actually moving away from a lot of this stuff. So if either one of you wants to take an approach on the US's, where that's going to put us in the future based on what China's doing and what we're doing in that area.
Well, China has been trying to move their economy more to a consumer-based economy and away from an export-based economy. The pandemic is, again, going to sort of throw a little bit of a roadblock in there because, again, you know, they took a hit to GDP. they've had an increase in unemployment. It's really hard to tell from official statistics what that is, but it's happened. So, I mean, they've been trying to move away from sort of this, I'll call it almost a mercantilist type of system that they had, where they would try to grow through exporting. Now they're trying to take advantage of their massive population, huge growing middle class. The Belt and Road Initiative is an initiative, it's economic, and there's some politics to it. We're seeing today that there's a little bit of pushback from a lot of the countries participating, because again, a lot of the Belt and Road financing from China is loan financing, it's not grant financing. And so what this has done is it's add to the debt levels of countries at a time where countries, are suffering extra costs from the pandemic and for providing unemployment and different things like that. And China begrudgingly has, in most cases, given most countries sort of a timeout for a 6 to 12 month period on payments. So, again, China is using economics because, money talks in the end to try to form, we'll call them relationships, partnerships with other countries across the world. But again, let's take a look at what China's main objective is. It's to increase their GDP. Okay, yeah, through the process, they may increase other countries' economic well-being, but really China's still looking at it selfishly saying, okay, if we can build bridges or dams, that's money coming into the country. If we can sell things to these countries, that's money coming into our country. So they're still focused on that. Which,
John, by the way, John, you mentioned this, but they take ownership. They might begrudgingly give them 6 months or 12 months, but they take ownership of ports and ownership of dams and ownership of federal buildings in these countries that they're helping, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they are. And I think a lot of these countries are just now realizing what was buried in the fine print of some of these agreements.
Okay, we have a question here from James Gross. I'm specifically interested in how businesses handle the shift that the whole world sees coming. How does a company lift and shift production from a global scenario to a regional/domestic scenario? How do they manage their current vendors who must be on the lookout for evidence of a shift and ensure supply while maintaining steady pricing and quality until they can shift the production home?
Well, to me, it's a transition. I mean, you just don't cut your supply chain and start over again. It is definitely a transition. And, it's going to take some work to try to find, new vendors or other vendors that you're not used to working with. The question was the price issue, and that's going to be a huge issue. I mean, who drives prices down? It's the consumer constantly wanting low prices. And there's going to be a realization that sooner or later, the consumer's got to pay a higher price for some of these things to happen just because of higher different labor costs in the US, taxes and things like that. So it's going to take time, but to be honest with you, it should have already started. Because again, when you take a look at, we put tariffs on China a year and a half ago, and that's really hurt supply chains already. That's when companies should have said, what's the future look like? And again, you take a look at politics, both parties are not pro-China, and you should have already started looking at this. And, there are some companies that are actually taking a look at growing vendors. They're providing some startup capital to small businesses to at least have them as maybe not a sole supplier, but as a secondary supplier.
By the way, we have talked to, I mentioned this earlier, many small firms that made a transition very quickly because they were forced to, right? When China happened in the very beginning of the pandemic here and China shut down, they found other suppliers and they did it very quickly under, pressure. And of course, their customers were thrilled as long as they got the product they were looking for at the quality they were looking for, at the price they were looking for. That was the challenge for the companies. And many were surprised that they could do that still. So it is something to keep in mind that it does happen, James, quickly on occasion. When you want to plan a little more in advance, it's going to take time to do it right, take time to make that work. Many of these relationships that develop these chains in China took years to develop. So it can't happen smoothly overnight, but it can certainly happen quickly. Greg, if it's okay, let's transition a little bit to an area I know you're closer to your heart. When we start talking about the change of the flow of imports and exports, the US, for example, not importing oil to the same degree that they did for years, or China becoming less of an export nation and more of an import nation. Talk to me a little bit about what that does to currency and what we would expect from that.
Sure. Well, obviously they're kind of codependent in the equation, right? Exports and imports can certainly drive the value of currencies up or down, and likewise, the currency value going up and down can drive exports and import valuation. To me, I think it is one of the most fascinating questions. What is next in terms of our currency, right? Right. Everybody takes a great deal of pride in their national currency. Obviously, countries having their own independent monetary policy is super important to each of the countries, as we found out with the European debt crises and the crisis in Greece specifically. And, so currencies are important, but it almost seems like we're going to enter into some new phase. There are different opinions on cryptocurrencies, but there's probably not a lot of legs to something like that at the moment, but certainly in the future there's going to be changes. So how does the currency impact the situation? Well clearly, if you look at the currency markets from the broadest perspective, what do the currency markets do? They transfer purchasing power from the citizens of one country to the citizens of another. Right? If the value of the dollar goes up relative to the Japanese yen, Americans feel richer relative to Japanese citizens feeling poorer, and vice versa. So from that perspective, again, it kind of has interesting dynamics in terms of the whole conversation on globalization. Again, being a purely domestic firm, if 100% of your expenses are U.S. expenses, and if 100% of your revenue is U.S.-based revenue, you still have the issue of currency, because if the value of the yens weakens relative to the U.S. dollar, then clearly Japanese imports will be cheaper than the domestic products. So I think, again, that's just another factor that says that, yeah, globalization might be slowing down from the traditional sense, but we still have these currency markets that are constantly changing purchasing power, and that forces businesses to be more strategic in terms of where they're sourcing materials and where they're selling it.
Getting a little bit of garbled on your response. Maybe if you can lean forward a little bit when you talk. The other thing I'll say, Greg, when you're talking about this, it's kind of interesting, is we look at things like the stock market, and we like to think that there are reasons that we can predict it, but we know how unpredictable it is, and we do very, very poorly in the long run trying to predict the market. We would think currencies would be easier to predict. There are less variables. They're more easily understandable, possibly. There's more open information for people to understand currency effect. I look at the U.S. stock market lately, and I don't want to get this whole time on the stock market. We could, but the fact that unemployment in the U.S. has done what it's done in the last 2 months, right? The fact that the pandemic overall effect on people's confidence, let's say, combine those things with what we've seen and what's happening even in the news cycles that we're seeing day to day, and the fact that many people claim that the market was already overvalued to begin with, and yet the market's still rising and still rising, and it's hard to follow and make sense of it at some point. Currency exchange during this whole time, unemployment skyrocketing, U.S. probably the hardest hit, if not Italy, but probably the hardest hit of all nations by the pandemic. The lockdowns, again, the overall perception of the people, and yet the currency of the dollar has continued to grow in strength, it seems, globally. And it's hard to place that or understand that. Is there a reason for that? Is it easily explainable, or is it just one of those mysteries we have to try and accept?
Yeah, I would say that the dollar is king, right? So the vast majority of trade happens in dollars. All of our commodities are traded in dollars. And when the stuff hits the fan globally, everybody flocks to the US dollar, right? Everybody sells every other asset that they possibly can because they want to own the US dollar. They want to own US treasuries. So no matter how rough a shape that we seem to be in, no matter how dysfunctional our government seems to be, it's always relative, and that when people want to take risk out of their portfolios, they go to US treasuries. And so that's everywhere around the world. And that's really the simplest answer that you can get. So it is an amazing thing.
John, anything you want to add to that?
I mean, I agree with Greg 100%. I mean, the dollar is sort of like a magnet. I mean, we have so many international business transactions done, and even though the dollar is a floating currency, so it should be supply and demand that really impact the value of the dollar, the United States is still seen as a political and economic safe haven. And we've seen it even during the pandemic, during the last 3 months, how much foreign capital is still coming into the United States. And so, you know, that's why the dollar, I mean, it's slid a little bit lately, but I mean, you're right, it's really strong. And one thing I want to mention about understanding the dollar is a lot of people, when they hear that the dollar is strong, they think that that's a good thing overall. Even the president has touted a strong dollar. But like Greg said, if you have a strong dollar, well, what that does, it makes imports seem less expensive, but it makes our exports more expensive to foreign consumers and businesses. And so what that does, that hurts our exports. And so, you know, the whole thing of a strong dollar, it's I don't want to say it's more political than anything, and it sounds good. It's got the adjective strong in front of it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's a good thing.
Well, it's not good for businesses, but it's great for consumers because consumers get more choices.
And businesses, by the way, pay consumers, right, Greg? I mean, that's where we make our money. So you want the businesses doing well so the consumers do have that resource. So, okay, let's get back to globalization a little bit more clearly. You know, maybe reports of globalization being on its deathbed are a little bit exaggerated. Let's look at a couple companies that have done globalization at microspeed, because it used to be that it took forever, right? That companies would expand and they would go to one location, try to find some footing, try to spread out slowly in their geographic footprint, make some education happen for their companies. They learn how to create in that culture and how to be successful there. That's not the case anymore. Let's look at company Uber, for example. Uber in 6 years reached 80 countries. They didn't succeed in every case, right? But they reached 80 countries in 6 years. That's phenomenal. It's amazing. There were some small cases. I think there was one in Estonia where a local firm, you know, beat them out. But in most cases, they were successful. Netflix in under 7 years reached 190 countries. That's unbelievable. And so what is this telling us? If you can be, is there a way that companies are more agile today than they were in the past? Is it just that we're so much more connected? These are both firms that are based on mobile technology. And so maybe there's some real cachet to that, and that's where the opportunity lies. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think geography doesn't make a difference. You were saying how companies used to start in one city and then move to another city. I mean, that doesn't make a difference anymore. The case with Uber really is not a capital intensive business, so they should be able to move pretty quickly. I mean, who owns the cars? It's the Uber drivers. And so, I mean, they should be, and they did move really quickly. Netflix, though a capital intensive business because of the development of their programs and their movies, I mean, once they have those set, all they got to do is send a streaming signal. And a streaming signal can go anywhere that somebody can capture that streaming signal. So again, that's a really fast way to go global versus, you know, old school McDonald's or somebody like that, or a manufacturer that sort of plods along because again, they have to invest the capital, hire the people. I think, you know, when you take a look at the service industries, they should be able, and they are able to quickly go global because again, they don't need that huge capital requirement. All they need to do is get into an area and start establishing their brand. And for a lot of companies, their brand comes with them. I remember traveling in Europe years ago, and Uber was just starting. Well, actually, Lyft started first, but then Uber was starting, and people in Europe were like, "Well, what's this thing Uber?" See, they had already heard it. The brand was already out ahead of them, and so then when Uber comes into Europe, people aren't like, "What the heck is Uber?" They know what it is, and so it was really easy for them to spread.
You know, we talked, again, back to the beginning. One of the things we identified was that the definition of globalization is going to be the important thing. And the definition in the past was really kind of focused on tracking cross-border flows of physical goods, money, people, and that now it's going to be different. And isn't it really going to be focused on measuring connected consumers? And this goes to our conversation about the fact that Uber and Netflix can hit their stride quickly, right? But it really should be a measure of connected consumers, connected communication devices, connected machines, and we're monitoring the flow of data and ideas more than these physical goods and money and people.
Yeah, I would agree with you 100% on that. And again, it can go consumer to consumer so quickly. You know, all you need is your smartphone, and you download an app, and boom, you're global. And the company's global. They got a global footprint. I mean, that doesn't take much time. That doesn't take a lot of investment.
Greg, anything you want to add to that?
No, I just kind of goes back to, again, my different definition from Inder Nui is producing wherever it's most cost effective, selling wherever it's profitable, and sourcing capital wherever it's cheapest. And as John said, it's a lot of the examples you gave, they're capital light businesses from, right? You're not putting up bricks and mortar. It's just another line of code or you know, a URL address and you're in business. So Airbnb, right? Largest hotel company with no hotel rooms. Or Uber, the largest transportation company. They don't own any cars. And Netflix, right? They started out not in the production business. They were just simply in the distribution business. You know, it wasn't until later on that they grew that they started on the production business in order to keep growing their subscription services. Again, I don't think any of that's going to change.
Okay.
Hey, Jeff, Ken Hurd had a really good question that I'm just reading about the cost differences between circuit boards not being labor-based but regulation-based. And, you know, the U.S., we've been, under this administration, dropping some of the regulations and some of the regulation costs. But will we ever get down to the level of China? The answer to that's no. But I want to flip it around in that China now is starting to add regulations. They're finally being concerned about the economy, or I should say the environment. And so China is actually working the other way, and they've started to regulate things because they realize that their water systems are polluted. Remember the Beijing Olympic air episode where they closed Beijing down for like 8 weeks to try to clear the air out and things like that? So, I mean, you know, bringing things, and I'm not just saying it's going to come to the US, you know, it's going to come to other areas. I mean, you're seeing a lot of movement to Vietnam. I know the EMBA class went there a couple of years ago, and I remember talking to students, and they were like amazed at the dynamic environment up there. Malaysia.
John, what happened with that was we went to China for a few years in a row, and we started to find that China, which we went there because of the manufacturing, because of all the things they were doing for the US, we wanted to understand it. And then we found that China was starting to lose manufacturing to Vietnam. And so we said, well, we should go to Vietnam. We should find out what's happening. And we did. And the trip was amazing. I mean, we had great access and visited great companies. One example, we visited a company that was an Italian company in Vietnam. The name of the firm was Data Logic. Most people have never heard of them, but they make the scanners that are in every Wegmans. The actual scanners that are being used by the register. They're being made at an Italian firm in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. This kind of connects things a little bit. But this goes back to the point you just made. So it used to be that labor costs, Ken, this is my addition to your question. It used to be that people chased labor costs. And so for a long time, we went to China. Then the cost of labor in China started to rise as they started to grow a middle class. And people started to chase to Vietnam and to the Philippines and depending on the technology or the high technology aspect of it, to places like Bangladesh. They would go to where they could find cheaper labor. But labor is only one component of the whole picture. And as China developed, they certainly started to add regulation. And they're going to continue to increase that. And so if you're chasing that, you're going to chase it from country to country as well. And as those countries develop, you're going to have to go to the next country on the list. And this is what happens. So there are reasons that the US is more expensive in places and things like that. But most of those reasons we appreciate. So for example, we went to South Africa on a trip and we went through a tour of a paper mill. And there were people on the tour that were terrified. These were US people that worked in manufacturing here that thought that the setup at this place was likely going to result in somebody's death. It was a terrifying experience, but it is what the world is when you're in a developing country. The US at one time was a developing country and didn't have all the regulations and controls. We do now. So yes, it's more expensive, but there's a reason that it is, right? We have much more designed for safety and protection of our employees. If you've been to China back in the 90s or in the 2000s, you probably saw, because they used to say the national bird of China was the crane. Because if you ever drove anywhere in China, you saw about 100 cranes in the city lifting up the next building. And many of these places, at 100 stories up, there are people wandering on beams with no attachment, no wires, no connection, walking without helmets at construction sites. It was really a very, very different environment than what we were used to. But they are changing that now, and we expect that to continue. And so people will have to chase that to the next country down the line. Does that match up with your understanding? Greg, what were you going to add?
I was going to add to that, like kind of one of the things that we haven't talked about yet was the whole concept of robotics and artificial intelligence and how that's going to have an impact on all of those types of things. I think that's probably where you're going to see the biggest change in globalization. Again, that definition of producing wherever it's most cost effective, not cheapest, but most cost effective. And if the cost of capital in the United States is cheap enough where companies can add robots and AI and remove that element of needing labor, right? And again, so what is the one thing that we learned from COVID is any job where there was people involved, we had to send those people home and they couldn't do it. So I think one of the big learnings that companies are going to have is, okay, how do I do this without people? Right. And then once you take people out of the equation, then it doesn't matter what country that you're producing in. The labor cost doesn't matter. It's wherever do you want to set up your automated manufacturing. So, I think, maybe optimistically, right? What is one of the greatest things about Rochester is its advanced manufacturing capabilities. And so if there is a shift away from the need for labor, I think Rochester could be a big winner.
Well, it used to be, Greg, that when we got to that type of technology, this is where the US specialized. And John, back to your point, you were talking about production possibility frontiers. You were talking about specialization, right? And the whole idea is that the countries that can do it best, because if you want to create your maximum GDP, you create where the most value is for your country. And it may not be in farming, or it may be in farming to a certain degree, but it can't be all the way to one end. And this high technology stuff used to be a special product for the US, used to be where our space was. But there are a lot of countries out there that can do this high-end technology now. Do you think the US is going to come out on top in this area, Greg, when it comes to AI and not just AI, but to these robotics and automation? Or do you think that we're going to end up taking a back seat?
No, I think that we have actually a really good shot at this. I think we're much further ahead than a lot of countries, and I think, yeah, if we continue to invest in it, if we learn from the lessons that we've just had in the last 3 months, I think you are going to see an acceleration and a focus on, okay, how do we actually be great at this?
Well, my fear is that we don't think long-term enough. And so these companies are trying to hit quarterly deadlines and they're looking for stock prices, and CEOs are, compensated on that next quarter stock price. And these don't return very quickly. These return longer scale, and they do have great upside, right? But it takes large investment. Unless you get a governmental backing, something like the moonshot to start working in these areas, we may get passed by. And that's my fear. I'm not sure I know where that's going to come out, but that's my thought. How about you, John?
Well, I agree with that. I mean, the two systems, though, China and the US economically are so different. The Chinese have a lot of SOEs, state-owned enterprises, that are huge firms that get special loan terms from government-based banks and things like that. The country has an industrial policy, which the US really doesn't. I mean, Japan has had industrial policies for years. I mean, Japanese companies do 10 and sometimes 20 and 25-year plans. So there's some different systems. I think that the US, I think that because of the freedoms in our economy, I think that that gives us a huge advantage in AI and a lot of the other different technologies. But again, when you take a look at the Chinese system, it's run as sort of a one voice, one direction system. And so they're allocating all their resources that way. And Jeff, you were talking about, you know, companies as far as investing and ROIs and things like that. And you take a look at what happened to the airline industries here in the United States, okay? So your major air carriers, what were they doing with all the money that they've been generating over the last 5 or 6 years from this explosion of travel? Were they reinvesting it in new fuel efficient planes? Were they investing it in any kinds of R&D to improve customer service? The money went for stock buybacks. Stock buybacks is not R&D. And so again, it's a different view of sort of how you run the business.
No, John, that goes to my point though. Stock buybacks are designed by CEOs who think that it's going to raise the price of the stock, which is how they're compensated. This is an agency theory problem that we need to understand in the US we don't do very well. If you want to think longer term, I think that the state-owned enterprises have a large advantage because they can think long term. The shareholders and stockholders of a company, they're not thinking long term. They're thinking, what's my stock going to be worth at Christmas? Right? And that's a problem.
And I agree with you. I still think that there's benefits to the system, not necessarily that we're quarter to quarter thinkers, but again, what we do is that quarter to quarter puts some pressure on us to cut costs and innovate and things like that. So again, I agree with you, it's an agency issue. And don't forget that for CEOs, a lot of their compensation is based on stock prices increasing. So this is sort of in their self-interest to do buybacks to get that stock price up. I mean, to me, I've always thought that that's, I don't know what other term to use, but a little bit of a conflict of interest in running the company short-term versus running the company more intermediate or long-term.
By the way, I'm just going to say this out loud for people to hear me. Matt Phillips, I think his internet must not be working because I haven't seen a question from Matt yet, and that's very unlike him. But we'll keep our eyes open because maybe there'll be something coming in. Anybody else that's out there has a question, please put it in the chat and we'll make sure to ask it. Greg, what do you expect to happen to the US currency as we come out of this? What do you expect when we finish the pandemic, we get back to work? What do you think is going to be the result?
Okay, so I'll start by saying that I disagree with one of your earlier statements wholeheartedly in that stock prices are more difficult to predict than currency values. I would say that it's completely opposite. I think there are 1,000 times more variables that go into currency values than what goes into stock price. Stock price, all we have to do is predict the future cash flows into perpetuity, and we can do that pretty easily compared to...
You don't want to take into account what everybody thinks about that? You don't think there's a social response to that?
Yeah, no, I'm not the textbook finance guy, that's for sure. But I'm just saying that I think that stock currency valuations are a lot more difficult. You do pretty much have to predict what the global economy is going to do, and I think that's a much bigger task.
I'm going to push back in a friendly way and just say, with those countries' currencies, you're evaluating approximately 150 to 200 currencies against each other, and with the stock, you're evaluating it against what 500 million people think about that investment. And it doesn't necessarily have to do with rational behavior. It often has to do with quite irrational behavior. But it certainly is worth a discussion, and I think both are highly unpredictable, which goes to our point. So I think we're on the same page there.
Yeah. So what happens to the dollar going forward? Yeah, as John said, we've kind of backed off a little bit, and I think that's what you'd expect as things kind of calm down. We saw the volatility index come down. We've seen oil prices go back up. All of everything in stocks going up, and everybody's kind of backed off, right? But I would say that I think the longer term trend is probably dollar strength. Again, just because of I hope that we can continue to innovate. I think that the U.S. is still one of the leaders in terms of innovative products and services. I hope that the political environment stabilizes. But obviously these are the types of things that you're going to look at.
Greg, there was a time not too long ago when the dollar was under pressure, or under threat to be replaced as the world currency. And that seems to have gone away. Do you agree? I mean, is that really kind of transitioned back to the dollar is solid, it's going to remain the global currency?
Yeah, I think, for the political regimes that don't like the United States, like Iran and Russia and China, they want an alternative, right? So of course, China would like to have trade conducted in yuan, but at the same time, they won't relax the restrictions on the yuan being fully convertible across the world. So right, so there's a little bit of a mismatch between what they're saying and what they're hoping for and what they're doing, because they fully understand that their banking system isn't capable of becoming the world leader, right? If you want to, right, if you want to be the world reserve currency, you have to be prepared to be like the U.S. and issue a tremendous amount of debt, right? You have to issue debt in order for the rest of the world to have your currency available to you. I don't think a lot of countries are tripping over themselves to sign up for that goal.
So Japan issues enough debt to maybe put themselves in that position, but their dollar, their yen is not going to be replacing anybody anytime soon. It's certainly under a very different pressure. Interesting.
Yeah, the vast majority of their debt is held locally as well.
Yeah, and by the way, the U.S. debt, I think it's 120%, something like that, of GDP, and really not a concern. I mean, in all essence, it's that's not a threatening number when, as you said, they're able and willing to issue as much as they need to.
Yeah, but that's a change of sort of how we viewed things. I mean, it used to be sort of a standard that you didn't want your debt to GDP ratio to be above 70%. And then Japan and China crushed that. I believe both of them are over 200% debt to GDP. And so now we're like, well, the US is only 120 to 130 debt to GDP. That's not a big deal. And to me, I'm like, a little bit more old school in how I learn things. I'm like, well, what happens to our benchmarks? We just keep jacking those benchmarks up. And I agree that, the Fed is flooding the economy with liquidity, which really is the main reason why the stock market has been going up, because there's all this money out there. And where do people put it? They're not putting it in savings accounts, not in CDs, not bonds. So they're throwing it into stocks, and based on supply and demand, the stock prices are going up. So it's really interesting how our perspective of what is a okay GDP debt ratio or debt to GDP ratio has changed.
Well, by the way, John, to Greg's point, the U.S. should be in a different category when it comes to that. The fact that they're the global currency means that they really can have a higher debt to GDP ratio. Japan is 240%. You're right; they're over 200%. That's a big problem, and we know what's been going on. They've been in a rut for many, many years trying to figure it out. We're one of the few. Actually, it's been discussed, but we still haven't gone to negative interest rates. Many countries have. It's interesting, and that's a completely different discussion that we could have, but we've only got a few minutes left here, so maybe we don't have the time to launch into that. But there's still confidence in the U.S. dollar, and that's the key point here, is that if that were to slide, that would create greater problems. And it wasn't that long ago that there was concern that it might be replaced. And it wasn't just the yuan, it was the euro, it was there was pushes from different sides. those are all gone. None of them are really a concern at this point. And that's interesting because that provides the ability for the US to create that higher level, that higher leverage, right? And they've certainly capitalized on that.
Yes. You know, I'd like to get back just to what we started off with, Jeff, where you asked me what I thought was happening globalization. And, you know, I believe it's going to decline, and I believe the pandemic will give it a little push. But at the same time, US businesses need to be global. They need to continue to look for other markets, to look for huge groups of middle-class consumers in these growing economies. When you take a look at the data of the US, we're about 340 million people. We just in 2019 had the lowest birth rate in our history. Okay, a lot of US consumers have a good amount of debt. So when you take a look at the demographic issues and some of the economic issues, these companies, if they want to grow sales and profits, they need to get out of the United States. And that is what globalization was from the very beginning, was seeking out new markets to sell things. So that hasn't changed at all. Okay, the US businesses still need to do that. Now they're going to have to put their track shoes on because they're going to have to go over some hurdles, because there's going to be some different hurdles put in their way, not only by the US government, but also by lots of other governments we talked about are becoming very nationalistic also.
Countries used to bend over backwards to get McDonald's or Starbucks, and now they're making their own. They don't want that. They want to create their own, right?
Right.
Okay. Anybody else out there have questions? Because we're just about to wrap this up. And while we're waiting to see if they chat something, Greg, anything else you want to add before we wrap it up?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, John, you good?
Yeah, I'm good. I think that, you know, this is a beginning discussion. We just got to follow the trail to see what happens with it. And we're not saying that there's going to be an end to globalization. I don't think anybody has said anything about that. We're just saying that globalization isn't going to look like it did 20 or 30 years ago. And, you know, don't forget that the issues of globalization, I remember in 1995, I was in Washington, D.C., and unfortunately, that was when a World Trade Organization meeting was in Washington, D.C. at the same time. I remember I was walking around the Capitol building as a tourist, and suddenly a protest of 10,000 people came out from around the corner. Who were these people? They were American farmers, they were labor unions, and they were protesting, you know, globalization and free trade. And at the same time in Europe, you had the farmers driving their tractors to Paris, and you had these all over the place. So the whole negative aspects of globalization, they've always been there and they've been simmering. It's just over the last decade, maybe a little bit more than a decade, that's really become more to the forefront.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you, Greg. You mentioned at the end there, John, about the putting people there in leadership that know how to have a global strategy and take their opportunities for these companies. Fortunately, we have a lot of people here that are at this session that have that capability, that skill set. I see a lot of EMBA alum names out here, and I know there are a lot of other ones out there. So if you have interest in hearing these kinds of conversations, these are the types of things we talk about in class, but also at lunch on a class day, also in our teams, in our group meetings. So if you're interested in having those kinds of conversations and you're not already an EMBA alum, let us know and we'd be happy to tell you how that works, what the program looks like. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to have a recording to send out later for those that weren't able to attend, and I'm sure we'll get it to those that were here as well in case you came late. I'm going to stick around in case anybody's got a question they want to ask, but otherwise, thank you for your time and have a great day.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, John. See ya.
Oh, Matt, you're so nice.
Oh, thanks. Have a good one, guys.
Yeah, have a good one, Matt.
Bye.
Hey guys, have a good weekend. I'll see you.
Thank you very much, John.
Got to cut the lawn.
Enjoy it.
Yep.
Bye, John.
Bye-bye. See you, Jessica.